If you would like to ask a question, put up your.
Thank you so much, Mark. Can you all see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay,
Good.
terrific. Well, then I'll get started. So it's a pleasure to have the chance to talk with you this evening. I had the chance to learn a little bit from Joyce and Mark about your organization, and it's really a pleasure for me to have the chance to share about some of the work I'm doing, as well as some insights with respect to the newest dietary guidelines for Americans that just came out last month that you may have been reading about in the news. I know there are a lot of Canadians in this group. I don't know whether you've been paying attention to the dietary guidelines and some of the things that RFK Jr. has been doing in our country. This is one of the items that I think is actually relatively less controversial, and I will explain why in the course of our conversation this evening. At any point that you like, please feel free to ask questions. This is a nice small group, so I'm happy to have the chance to interact directly with you. So first, I'll be giving you some background and history of the US dietary guidelines. Sometimes it's thought that maybe they only go back to the 1970s. They actually go all the way back to 1894. But they looked very, very different at the time. And then after walking you through some of the different dietary guidelines that existed throughout the course of history in the United States over the last 130 years, I'll go into what's specifically new about the 2026 dietary guidelines that, as I mentioned, just came out last month and caused quite a stir, quite a lot of controversy. And I'll kind of dissect what that may have been about and some thoughts from the nutrition sciences in this area. Next, I'll describe the work that I'll be doing, that I am currently doing as part of the World Health Organization's food-based dietary guidelines. We're basically doing the same thing as the US Dietary Guidelines Committee, except that it is not recommendations for the US, but for most of the world. That is for all United Nations member states, and there's 217 member states. And then in this context, I also would like to share with you some of my experiences because I used to be funded by the US Agency for International Development, which the Trump administration terminated last year. But before that time, I had been working with them since 2013. And toward my last several years was leading their Ethiopia Reach project. And what I saw working on the ground not only in Ethiopia, but in Kenya, Tanzania, Mali, South Africa, on what the real meat of the problem is as far as diets there. The last part of my talk is going to be about whether agricultural biotechnology can play any role, and if so, what role, in dealing with some of these issues, which are not just nutritious, but also cultural in context. And then I'd love to hear your thoughts about the value of these guidelines and biotech when we wrap up. So first, a brief history through time of the US dietary guidelines for Americans. As I mentioned to you just in the last slide, these had their origins in 1894, and I want to place that time in a bit of context for you. At that time, the US Department of Agriculture, or USDA, had existed since 1862. So in fact, it was founded during the Civil War. At that time, the US did not even have an FDA yet, a Food and Drug Administration. That was not founded until 1906. And even the Department of Health and Human Services was not founded until 1980. And that was, in fact, something that had changed from an earlier department called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which was founded in 1953. So the original intent of the USDA was only to help farmers largely when it was founded in 1862. Then the very first notion of nutrition as being something that USDA could consider started in 1894 when Dr. True, who was the director of USDA's Office of Experiment Stations, wrote to the Secretary of Agriculture at the time and said, well, we really have a responsibility to care about the other side, not just the producers, the farmers, but also the consumers, the American public. And to that end, we need to make sure that Americans are aware of dietary guidelines for optimal nutrition and health. What I love about this letter, which represented the first dietary guidelines, is that there were only two dietary guidelines. Two. Number one, milk is a near perfect food, was the first dietary guideline. Number two. So I do want to mention before I go into the second point that what you'll see in the nutrition sciences and in popular nutrition is that what goes around comes around. Whole milk is good, whole milk is bad, whole milk is good, whole milk is bad, whole milk is good, over and over. Same with coffee, same with a carnivore diet. We call it the carnivore diet today. Back then, they called it the beef only diet. And there were some Americans who were, in fact, following a beef only diet. And what Dr. True had to say to the Secretary of Agriculture about it is, well, that is one-sided. And so we should not recommend it. It's like, okay, good advice. But so those were the two dietary guidelines in 1894. If we fast forward to 1917, by that time, FDA was already founded, not yet DHHS, which RFK Jr. is now leading in the United States. In that particular year, USDA published a guidebook for housekeepers. So this was mainly the wives and the mothers of households in America. Once again, they're preaching the value of milk. And one specific guideline there is a quart of whole milk a day for each child is not too much. So once again, they're pitching the idea that existed back in 1894 of milk being a near perfect food, especially for children. And I do have to say that the work I was doing in Ethiopia, literally just a year ago, also had to do with whole milk for children. So again, what goes around comes around. Um, when you fast forward to the 1940s, what you'll see is the first inkling of what begins to look like the modern dietary guidelines for Americans, except that it's not in the shape of a pyramid. It is in the shape of a wheel, kind of most similar to My Plate, which was the last iteration before RFK Jr. And you can see that in this black box in the middle of this screen. What I think was really interesting in that case is that they talked about the necessity for each of us to eat from 7 different food groups, but take a look at how they divided them up. Butter and fortified margarine makes up an entire seventh, which I just find extraordinary and very, very interesting because that's a lot of butter and margarine. And they specifically divided up the produce. They didn't say a certain number of servings of vegetables, a certain number of servings of fruits like we do today. They said all of the green and yellow vegetables are one slice of the pie, and then all of the red vegetables and fruits are another slice of the pie, and you should be eating from both. And once again, I want to highlight what goes around comes around because lycopene, which is in all of those red and orangish and pinkish vegetables and fruits, including tomatoes and grapefruit and papaya, have recently been found to uniquely reduce the risk of atherosclerosis. They didn't know that at the time, but they were already dividing produce into those different colors. And, there may have been some wisdom in that because now we are finding in modern nutritional sciences that that absolutely makes sense to do. And if you take a look at the 1984 food wheel, which is right next to it to the right, you can see the sizes begin to be a little bit different. There begins to be a bit of a shift in the types of foods in each of the pies. And then here's where the pyramids begin. So again, for a little bit of background, all of these dietary guidelines that had been published before 1980 were not necessarily official. They were suggestions. They were published for housekeepers, basically, and for those who were managing the diets of American households. 1980 was the first year that the dietary guidelines for Americans became official, and it was recognized as being a joint effort and publication of 2 different U.S. departments. The newly formed Department of Health and Human Services, or DHHS, which, as I mentioned earlier, is what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. now directs, as well as the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, that now Brooke Rollins directs. And in 1992 is where the very famous food guide pyramid that you see in the upper center was formulated. What you can see from this pyramid is that the grains form the base of the pyramid, and they don't make any distinction at the time, even just 30 years ago, about whole grains versus processed or ultra processed grains. Instead, you can see several different kinds of bread. You can see something that looks like cereal, something that looks like a plate of spaghetti, and then some crackers. What I love is that they include rice and they put in a pair of chopsticks, which I think is kind of an interesting cultural nod. So that is supposed to be, you're supposed to be getting 6 to 11 servings every day of these grains. And they could be ultra processed, like bread and pasta or other things. And then you go up to the next tier. That's where the produce is, the vegetables and the fruits. And then you go up another tier, and there's the dairy foods, and then the other animal source foods, the meats, and also legumes like beans and nuts. And then to use sparingly at the top, the sugar, the fats, and the oils. Now, if you kind of think back to the period between 1992 and 2005, that was when we in the nutritional world and also the information became more available in the public that a number of people had celiac disease and various different levels of gluten intolerance. And with that understanding, then it really didn't it wasn't a good look that mostly bread and other gluten-containing foods were considered to be the base of the pyramid because suppose you couldn't even eat the base, then what did that say? So instead, in 2005, My Pyramid came out, and here you can see that it's not just one category of food that makes up the base, but a wide variety of different foods. And not only is this because of issues related to a gluten-free diet, but also because there was a movement, again, as you might remember in the 1990s and the early aughts, where we were interested in the Atkins diet, the South Beach diet, the paleo diet, the keto diet, which tend to be relatively low carb diets. Now, if you fast forward again to 2011, that is when My Plate for dietary guidelines, the visual came out. And I would argue that this really made more sense from a communication standpoint with the public because we can each kind of easily imagine a plate of food and say you can divide it roughly in half, and half of it should be made of produce, a little bit more vegetables than fruits, 3 servings of vegetables, 2 servings of fruits, and then the other side will be made of the whole grains and the meat or the animal source foods. And here's a little bit of dairy as something to drink. Well, now we had that My Plate for 15 years until the 2026 dietary guidelines came out. I should mention that these typically come out every 5 years, but with each iteration, they can keep the same dietary guidelines if they agree with them based on what was published 5 years ago. This represents a departure from the previous 15 years, but interestingly, not so far a departure from past decades ago. What I mean is that if you take a look at what has been called this inverted pyramid of the current US dietary guidelines, what you'll see is that the top is made up of the protein, the dairy, and the healthy fats, as well as the vegetables and the fruits. And beans are in there, potatoes are in there, avocados, but of course there's the controversial red meat that's near the top. There's also salmon, there's eggs, seafood, and then the whole grains. Note the attention to whole grains and not ultra-processed grains. It makes up a relatively tiny corner at the bottom. I mean, let alone that this is not very architecturally sound. It does represent quite a departure from the most recent years. These dietary guidelines really emphasize protein and produce, and now saturated fats and red meat have more emphasis than in the recent past. Whereas if you think back to what I just mentioned to you about the 1894 dietary guidelines, this is not that different from that. Nobody ever said, they're still not saying a carnivore diet is good, but they don't exclude red meat. Grains get a much smaller billing, and they really focus on whole grains, our new dietary guidelines. In particular, there are mandates within that 11-page dietary guidelines, which is actually a very reasonable length, to limit highly processed foods. They don't use the more controversial term ultra processed, which is laden with a lot of different types of meanings. They say limit highly processed foods and limit foods with added sugars. And if you would like to take a look at that longer, the 11-page dietary guidelines, you can find it at that particular URL. What else?
Felicia, before you go on, could you
Mhm.
comment on the reason that the guidelines in the 80s insisted, or 70s and 80s insisted that on lots of carbs and very little fat? I've read that there was some politics behind it, but I'm not really familiar with the details. Could you comment on that, please?
Absolutely. There were some controversial studies that had been coming out in the 1970s that really kind of cast saturated fats in a very negative light. And so for a number of decades, it was believed that fats, and in particular saturated fats, were bad for human health. And in addition to that, you may remember in 1982 that it was determined that eggs were harmful to our health. And so it was harmful to even eat as much as one egg per day, although they said you could probably get away with eating one egg per day, and that was okay. And now more nutritional epidemiology studies have come out and cast questions on those studies from the 1970s, saying, well, we don't in fact see evidence of saturated fat, including butter, being harmful for human health. And in fact, a lot of fingers were pointed at the sugar industry, which was trying to kind of keep the focus away from sugar and thereby cast fat as or demonizing fat, so to speak.
Thank you. I think Deandra has a question.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I just have a very quick question. So when I worked at the Foreign Agricultural Service in the 90s, we worked very much with the commodity groups to help them export commodities. So that was the Grain Council, the Beef Council, the Wheat Council, the Soybean Council. And at the time, that was when the 1992 guidelines, I think, came out or shortly thereafter. There was a lot of speculation that, in fact, it was the commodity groups that were lobbying USDA to have
That's
their
exactly, yes.
their grains or their no grains their products be elevated on the pyramid. Had you heard similar, Felicia?
Not so much. So that's a great point, Deandra. I didn't hear that as much about the Wheat Council and the Soybean Council. I definitely heard that the sugar industry was trying to take the focus off it, which is why you could have do you remember Snackwells? All those 100-calorie cookies that had no saturated fat but were loaded with sugar. What I had heard mostly was that the sugar industry was lobbying to demonize the fats in order to take the focus off sugars. I'd not heard the same from the Wheat Council or Soybean Council or some of the other groups, the commodity groups. But it wouldn't surprise me that if the sugar industry was doing this, then maybe others were saying, "Hey, we're not fat. We don't contain fat. We'll kind of jump on the bandwagon and paint some other commodity as the boogeyman, so to speak." I could envision that being the case.
Great. Well,
And
thank
this
you.
is not
Please
to
go
say,
on.
by the way, that it's not happening right now. It's just a matter of whether this information is going to come out. And at least, I mean, thinking about some of those political um, influences is definitely important. Um, in fact, if you don't mind, I'm going to tell a little story about that.
Sure, go
These
ahead.
different industries definitely have an impact on what the public thinks is healthy food versus unhealthy food. And I'll give a seemingly innocuous example of that. We think a lot about the grain industries, we think about the soybean industry, the sugar industry. There's also a raspberry industry. And I don't think anybody could have anything bad to say about raspberries, but not just several years ago. I think it was just 4 years ago that I was participating in a conference like I was one of several speakers on diets and cancer. And one of my colleagues, Steve Clinton from the Ohio State University, gave a very, inspirational talk about how raspberries prevent cancer, or they may help to reduce the risk of tumor formation and other things. And we were all just caught up in this. Oh, yes, raspberries, and we had the chance to ask questions, both among the panel and then with the audience. And I asked Steve, how did you even think to look at raspberries in the first place? And he said, oh, because the raspberry industry paid me to do this work. If it were the strawberry industry, I'd probably be looking at strawberries. If it were the blueberry industry. And so that really made me think that there was nothing wrong with the raspberry industry funding this work, but it really is a question of who decides to fund this work. The strawberry industry has had very poor representation, I have to say. The blueberry industry is like a genius, I think, because everybody thinks that blueberries are the best thing in the world. And also the raspberry industry, but you never hear anything about strawberries. You don't hear about peaches. You don't hear about nectarines. They're not funding the work that could place them in the New York Times or CNN about or BBC or CBC about how great their particular product is. And so the public doesn't know about it. So absolutely, these industries do have that kind of indirect influence. And even if there's no bad intentions, I don't think anybody would blame raspberries for anything, but this is what happens. So moving on, thinking about these different food industries' influences, to get back to the more recent the current dietary guidelines, what else do these most recent dietary guidelines say? As I mentioned in the previous slide, they do talk about incorporating healthy fats, but here's a bit of an odd angle. For the first time, beef tallow is included as being a healthful fat. And here is where I think all of us in the nutrition sciences say, wait a minute, we don't have enough evidence for this. We're not going to automatically dismiss it, but we just don't have enough evidence that beef tallow is in fact beneficial for human health. Um, and then whole dairy with no added sugars. I think everybody would be on board generally with no added sugars because I think it's very, very well recognized that added sugars is not a good thing in our diet. But here again is whole dairy, whereas in the past, dietary guidelines were recommending no low fat or non-fat dairy. Although the total limit for saturated fats at 10% of total caloric intake per day remained the same. I still think that that's not something that's particularly helpful to the vast majority of Americans or anybody who might be reading these from around the world, because imagine you had a 2,500 calorie diet per day. That is it could be represented, maybe a little bit on the low end for Americans. Then what you'd think is that, okay, well, 10% of that or 250 calories can be devoted to saturated fats. I personally have no idea if I'm eating 250 calories of butter. And well, I know I'm not eating any beef tallow, but from other meat sources or something like that, or chicken skins or something, I don't know if I'm eating 250 calories. I don't think that that's too useful for the average American. So kind of more plain talk like this in serving sizes, I think is a bit more understandable. Another area that differs from what the Dietary Guidelines Committee had recommended this time was that what RFK Jr. and Brooke Rollins published said there was no specific encouragement to have a plant-based diet, but they basically said the exact same thing as past dietary guidelines: 3 servings of vegetables per day, 2 servings of fruit per day, and this interesting statement about eating fruit and vegetables throughout the day, the implication being breakfast, lunch, and dinner on average. Limiting alcoholic beverages, that's about the same as in past dietary guidelines. Now, for the first time, this year's dietary guidelines includes a discussion of the gut microbiome, which I actually think is a positive thing and is something that Christopher Gardner, a professor of nutrition at Stanford, specifically works on. And he was one of the co-chairs of the Dietary Guidelines Committee. So I wouldn't be surprised if that section came from him. The idea that it's really important to have a healthy gut microbiome, not just for our gastrointestinal tract, but for our brains, for our heart health, for the prevention of cancer and neurodegenerative diseases. So for the first time, we're recommending fermented foods, and they specifically say sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, and miso. I never thought I'd see miso in a dietary guidelines, but it's there. Really interesting. One thing that I thought was a bit gratuitous to the current political stage that we're in right now is that they not only removed the focus on nutrition equity, which was in the previous dietary guidelines, but they specifically said that they removed it. And they said, well, we don't care about issues of equity. We just want everybody to have a healthy diet. It's like, okay, you didn't really, I mean, so, but that's in there as well. So, and on that note, I think it is important to consider from a nutrition equity standpoint that there is a lot of socioeconomic status differences amongst Americans. Many who are on the SNAP program, which is our food, basically our food stamp program in the US. And I think in Canada, there's a similar type of program. And the foods that used to be on the SNAP program were all the ultra processed and the highly processed foods. And so I do think that there is a nutritional equity issue that ought to be addressed. And so it seemed a little strange that it was just removed, but not too much of a surprise. And then toward the end of the dietary guidelines was specific guidance for different age groups: infants and young children, children under the age of 5, up to the age of 18, and then the elderly, and also pregnant women and fetuses. And some of these represent departures from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans Committee, because a committee was formed to put together this information, and they shared with RFK Jr. and Brooke Rollins and their associated staff members their recommendations. The thing is, anytime you serve on a committee like this, and I'm serving on the same one for WHO, you give it to the policymakers. They do not have to follow your recommendations. They can just come up with their own. There are definitely some changes here. And one of the interesting things that this particular most recent dietary guidelines committee recommended that then did not actually make it into the official US dietary guidelines was that the committee recommended a plant-based diet, whereas the dietary guidelines took that out, did not include it. And this has been a source of controversy, by the way, not just recently, but for many, many decades. Is it in fact more nutritious, better for our health, to follow a vegan or a vegetarian diet? Past studies were not able to really confirm this very easily. If you look back as early as, gosh, the 1920s, it could be that people who are conscious about their diets at all, such that they would follow something like a vegan or a vegetarian diet, are more conscious about health overall. So maybe they're not smoking, maybe they're exercising, maybe they're more careful driving on the roads. And that could be what leads to better health outcomes, not the vegan or the vegetarian diet. It could also be that people who have easy access to fresh produce, like if you're living close to a Trader Joe's or you're living close to some other supermarket, are relatively wealthier, and or they might live in more healthful environments. That is, they don't live in what we in the US call food deserts, where you have to drive. I think the limit now is something like more than half an hour to get to a grocery store. And then a counter argument there is that, well, populations in low-income nations who eat primarily vegetarian diets, for example, in India and in Ethiopia, have lower life expectancies. So, of course, that doesn't take into account the entire lifestyles and environment. But then there was one set of studies that, in my opinion, from a nutrition epidemiology study, are some of the best quality studies to try to answer this question of whether a vegan or a vegetarian diet is in fact better for you. These were the Seventh-day Adventist studies that were conducted around the Loma Linda community, which is just outside Los Angeles in California. And one study that I like to highlight out of this whole collection of studies, which are still going on, by the way, is Orlick et al. 2013 that gathered a population, a cohort of close to 100,000 Seventh-day Adventists, and then followed them over a period of 6 years to determine whether their specific diets, vegan, vegetarian, pesco-vegetarian, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, versus omnivorous, what kind of health outcome they would have over the course of 6 years. Now, what is so special about these particular set of studies? They were conducting the studies among a very large population size, close to 100,000, as I mentioned. So the sample size is terrific. Statistically, this is great. And they were all Seventh-day Adventists, which is a Christian denomination that emphasizes healthy behaviors, specifically as laid out in Leviticus 11, discouraging alcohol, tobacco, illegal drugs, and generally following a healthful lifestyle. What's also really interesting for the purposes of a good statistical basis for the study is that 35% of Seventh-day Adventists identify as either vegetarian or vegan. This is much higher than the US national average. 9% of Americans are vegetarians, and between 1 to 4% are vegan. So 35% is over 1/3. This is a great population to study to look at health effects. And the other benefit is that they were all very similar socioeconomically. They were all following the same other healthy behaviors. And so you didn't need to control for a lot of other outcomes. Then what they did was to classify these near 100,000 individuals by 5 different types of diets: vegan, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, that is following a vegan diet, but then you also include dairy products and eggs; pesco-vegetarian, which is all of the above, but you also include seafood; semi-vegetarian, I don't really know what this means. I guess people you would categorize themselves as this if they followed a vegetarian diet sometimes, but maybe sometimes they ate a little bit of meat. And then non-vegetarian or an omnivorous diet that includes animal source foods as well as plant-based foods. Followed these near 100,000 individuals over the course of 6 years, and then they looked at age-adjusted death rates, mortality, in those 6 years from all causes ischemic heart disease, which is basically a narrowing of the blood vessels, which is what lycopene prevents, by the way, cardiovascular disease, aside from ischemic heart disease, all cancers, and then other causes. And what they were looking to find is what's called a relative risk or a hazard ratio. One of my roles is that I'm the past president of the Society for Risk Analysis, and we're constantly talking about relative risk, which is a dimensionless, a unitless unit, which basically states what your risk is of a particular disease or adverse outcome if you follow a particular diet, or you're being exposed to something in the environment, or you're following a healthy or an unhealthy behavior in general. Here's an example. Suppose there's a statement, you're 3 times more likely to die of lung cancer than a non-smoker if you smoke 1 pack of cigarettes every day. Here, the relative risk is 3. It's simply the rate of the disease in the exposed population divided by the rate of the disease in the unexposed population. The smokers versus the non-smokers, what's your likelihood of developing lung cancer over a lifetime? And we use this term, this relative risk, this number, to say, does following this particular type of diet or being exposed to, say, asbestos or arsenic or something in the environment cause harmful effects? If you get a relative risk or an RR or a hazard ratio that's greater than 1, what that means is that whatever you're being exposed to or whatever behavior you're following results in a higher disease risk. On the flip side, and this is what we want to look for in these vegan and vegetarian diets, if your relative risk is less than 1, then that means that your disease risk is lower based on whatever you're doing, like wearing a seatbelt every single time you drive, or exercising every day, or something like that, or being exposed to a good diet. These numbers are pretty small, but I want to show you what this study found. What this study found was that first they looked at both biological sexes combined, and that's what you see in the top several rows in this table. All of these numbers represent relative risks or hazard ratios, namely, what was your risk of dying compared to the reference diet, which is the omnivorous diet, because they were interested in understanding whether a vegan or a vegetarian diet was better than an omnivorous diet for our health. So if you take a look at these numbers, anytime you see a number that's less than 1, that is generally a good thing. And particularly if the 95% confidence intervals are all also less than 1, then that is a very, very good thing. You can generally see that there are some positive results in terms of vegan, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, pesco-vegetarian, semi-vegetarian compared to the reference if you combine the 2 biological sexes, but then look at the next set of rows. It's divided between the effects among the men and the women. And what you see here is that a vegan diet and a pesco-vegetarian diet are very, very good for men, and they are not good for women. Why might that be the case? Well, so I mean, you can take a look at some of these numbers, but you will just find some astounding results here. For example, if you look just at ischemic heart disease, if men follow a vegan diet, they were 55% less likely to die over the course of 6 years from ischemic heart disease than men following an omnivorous diet. That's astounding. And you can see by looking at the all-cause mortality that for men, following a vegan diet or a pesco-vegetarian diet that is including seafood is really, really good for reducing the risk of mortality, of all-cause mortality. But then take a look at the women. There is no specific diet that ends up doing better than the omnivorous diet. And what was a little bit scary to me to look at, because there was a time I was following a vegan diet as well, is that if you look at the upper bound of ischemic heart disease for women following a vegan diet, 2.24 is an enormously high. I mean, it's a scary high relative risk. Why do I think that's the case? Well, we're all friends here. I think there's 2 major reasons. One is that premenopausal women menstruate. We need to have a readily bioavailable iron in our diets unless we are regularly supplementing with iron tablets. And red meat and other kinds of meat are the best source of heme iron. Yes, there is iron in leafy green vegetables like spinach, but first of all, you have to cook it a little bit. Not only that, but you have to take it with some vitamin C in order to release the iron from the phytates that are binding it. Most people don't know that around the world, so they just eat the leafy greens like spinach and they don't care whether they're drinking some orange juice or anything. to go along with it. And so it's just non-heme iron. The body doesn't absorb it. It just passes out the body. And so there are dangers associated with anemia, specifically iron deficiency anemia among women that you rarely see in men. And the second issue, so that's the negative. On the positive side, women also have a much higher concentration of estrogen in our bodies than men do. And estrogen protects our heart health for much longer, and it also prevents against liver cancer. It has a variety of health benefits, particularly in the premenopausal years. And then even after a woman, after menopause, all of the benefit that the estrogen had been providing her cardiovascular system still has a lingering effect. And so you're not going to be seeing as many deaths from the various different kinds of heart disease, which is the major killer of all Americans and all people around the world. And that's why you see these differential results in men versus women. So, based on this type of research and other studies that came out of this particular group, who needs the iron in the protein and who cares or who should care? In a nutshell, premenopausal women and girls, athletes, because there is a greater need for protein to build up muscle mass, as well as the elderly. And this is an interesting point that it's a little bit alarming that after we hit the age of 30 on average, with every decade, unless we are specifically pumping iron and doing strength training, we lose about 3.8% of our muscle mass every decade. So by the time one gets to their 70s or their 80s, if you haven't been keeping up with strength training, then you could have much lower muscle mass. And that not only means weakness in terms of mobility and being able to carry on everyday activities, but it also means that there's less muscle to shield the bones in the case of bone breaks from falling and other things like that, which are really dangerous. Particularly amongst the elderly population. So having more protein is important, having more iron is important. I would say that these dietary guidelines that just came out are quite appropriate for females, for athletes, for the elderly. The interesting thing is that the one group that it doesn't really benefit is young or middle-aged men. But already, if you go on social media, you'll see, all these men like, yeah, I love these dietary guidelines. They say red meat. I want to keep on eating red meat. That's not the group that benefits. In fact, this is the group that suffers from eating too much red meat. So, yeah, and that's part of the problem. I think that many of us in the nutrition sciences would say, okay, if we really wanted to improve a population's health, we would be giving different dietary guidelines based on biological sex. Namely, we'd be advising men to follow a pesco-vegetarian or a vegan diet and women to be following an omnivorous diet, and also by age group. But we don't do this for humans. We do this for livestock and poultry. And because I've worked a lot in that area as well, the nutrition guidelines that we give to producers of poultry and swine, for example, have different requirements for male swine versus female swine, and then also at different stages of development. But we don't do this for Americans. I don't know if it's like that in other countries of the world. Maybe in Canada, it's more nuanced. It's not that way currently in the US. And this is some of the nuances of the US Dietary Guidelines Committee are very different from what we're doing on the WHO Food-Based Dietary Guidelines Committee. By the way, here I would like to clarify what's meant by food-based because when I've shared with friends and colleagues that I serve on this committee, they say, well, what do you mean food-based? Aren't all dietary guidelines food-based? What's meant by this, and it's the same in the US dietary guidelines, is that we're not going to tell people, oh, you should have this much vitamin K every day, this much vitamin D, this much beta carotene, this much vitamin C, because people are just not going to have any idea. I mean, I couldn't even tell you how many milligrams of vitamin C is in one orange. I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think most people do. And it varies based on the age of the orange, the size of the orange, everything. Instead, like the US Dietary Guidelines Committee, we on this WHO committee are going to be talking about different food groups and the importance of eating from a diverse set of different foods. It's quite similar to the US, but the main difference is that we have a mandate in our terms of reference from the WHO that we need to consider environmental impacts of agriculture as well. Wow, this is something very different from the US Dietary Guidelines Committee. I will point out that one of my friends at Michigan State University, Mike Ham, had served on the previous Dietary Guidelines Committee, and he was one of a small group in that committee that said we should be focusing on the environment too. But even then, they were not interested in considering it. Our current debate right now in our committee is about animal source foods versus plant-based foods, because there's a lot of interest in following a particular publication that came out in 2019, what was called the Eat Lancet Commission report, that asserted that a global diet that emphasized plant-based foods could be better for the environment as well as for human health. I think in that case, they were conflating effects for males and females. But there doesn't seem to be much of a question that indeed, if we could average them together, which I don't think we really can, a plant-based diet would definitely be better for the environment. And part of the reason for this is that we have to think about if we want to eat meat, what goes into feeding those animals that eventually become our meat. It turns out that if we want to produce just 1 pound of beef, we need to be producing 10 kilograms, well, 1 kilogram or 1 pound of beef requires 10 kilograms of maize and soybean, because that is what the beef cattle have to eat in order to be able to produce beef for beef consumers. And that means planting, using a lot of land for agriculture, and then all of the agricultural inputs, the chemicals, the fertilizers, the um, mechanical systems that require energy. So it is really not that great for the environment. And then if you also consider that beef cattle emit a lot of methane into the environment, that's also a greenhouse gas. So there are all kinds of concerns about the role of animal source foods in agriculture exacerbating climate change. This has caused a lot of controversy around the world, and we know about it on this committee. If you take um, another country like China, China has 1.4 billion people, and only recently, in recent decades, has a large segment of the Chinese population been raised out of poverty and into the middle class. And what we've seen happening, not just in China, but in other low to middle income countries that are becoming more developed, is that when there is the larger middle class, suddenly they want to follow what was traditionally called a Western lifestyle. They want to get a car. They want to start eating more meat, because all of these are not just they perceive to be more, beneficial for their own lifestyles and their health, but also they're kind of like a status symbol. And so we have had people from China protesting the Eat Lancet Commission report, saying, wait a second, all of you Westerners have been eating meat for centuries, and now we're only able to afford the meat, and you're trying to tell us that it's immoral to eat red meat when we never had a chance to do it in the past, and you all did. So there are those cultural issues. And then it's gotten, this is quite a sticky cultural issue, and I'm going to get to that later, but I just wanted to introduce it to you to keep it in mind that there is this issue between a kind of diet that would be beneficial for the environment versus cultural issues versus specifically nutritional issues, particularly for women and children and the elderly. When we consider agriculture, diets, and climate change, let's talk first about the food safety side. Another WHO committee that I just rotated off was its Foodborne Disease Burden Epidemiology Reference Group. It's a long name to say that we're the group that determines which particular contaminants in the global food supply cause the most disease and death. The top four, the top two are both Salmonella, non-typhoidal Salmonella enterica, and then Salmonella typhi, almost always found in chicken, in any kind of poultry, also found in limited, relatively less in pork and in beef. But you see, it's all animal source foods. Salmonella typhi, same thing. The third one, enteropathogenic E. coli, typically found in raw milk, found in eggs, insufficiently cooked eggs, found in beef, in pork, in poultry. Fourth, Tania solium, the pork tapeworm. I'm shocked that the pork tapeworm actually made the top four, but it did. Once again, only found in pork. What do you see about these top four? They're all found in meat. They're found in limited, relatively less in leafy green vegetables and in cantaloupe, but those are more kind of chance events. And it usually is because there's an agricultural field of spinach or romaine lettuce that's being grown downstream from a cattle operation. At least this is the issue we constantly run into in the United States, which is why we've had a problem with salmonella and E. coli in romaine lettuce every single year since 2016, because it's mostly being produced in Salinas Valley, California, downstream of enormous cattle operations. It's the cattle and their manure that are washing downstream and contaminating the leafy green vegetables. So there's the food safety issue to consider with respect to animal source foods, let alone the environmental issues and the contributions to climate change that I discussed to you earlier. And this was what was really motivating the Eat Lancet Commission. Why is it then that we have not considered climate change in the dietary guidelines for Americans? There is the complication with respect to differences in political beliefs, but this was true even with, say, Democratic administrations. And I think a large part of it is because our federal government is operating in silos. The dietary guidelines are a joint effort of DHHS and USDA, whereas environmental issues are governed by the Department of Interior, the Department of Commerce, which is where NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, sits, and also the Environmental Protection Agency, its own agency. And there's not really a lot of crosstalk, and they don't really get a say in the dietary guidelines. We're just kind of operating in these silos. We could consider in the future whether for interdisciplinary issues like human diets, whether there should be coordinated efforts. We do this for biotechnology. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that later. Should we do it for our dietary guidelines? And yet, even if we were to do so, to get back to the issue of cultural considerations, what I really see as the missing link, honestly, in my work with WHO, and what is literally and figuratively the real meat of the problem, all boils down to gender-related issues. And this is something that I've seen over 12 years of working with USAID and now 17 years of working in low-income countries around the world. That iron deficiency anemia, which exists in the US, but to a much lower extent, and we have ready access to iron tablets. Iron deficiency anemia is killing many girls and women in pregnancy and childbirth. And yes, I mean girls. We're talking about girls who were impregnated at the age of 11 or 12. And because they don't get enough iron in their diets, it really increases the risk of labor and delivery hemorrhage as well as postpartum hemorrhage. Red meat is abundant in this heme iron, as I mentioned earlier. The problem is, in many countries of the world, particularly throughout sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, women and girls cannot access meat. The men and the boys take it. The men and the boys are the ones who don't benefit from eating more red meat. They have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease as a result. But what the issue is that animal source foods are so scarce that whenever they become available in some low-income households, the most powerful people take it. And that's the men and the boys. At the most women and girls don't get any, or if they get any, they get the chicken feet, they get the chicken backs. If they're lucky, they get chicken blood, which relative to the feet and the backs have more iron. And this is not focusing on any one particular group. I'm Taiwanese American. My parents grew up in Taiwan. My father was the first son that was born in his household, and he saw it as being perfectly natural that because he was the firstborn son, he got all the meat and his older sisters didn't get any. It's just an expectation. And if it's not from outright control, they even impose superstitions about how women are evil or bad if they eat any red meat. And even if they eat eggs, then what that means is that your children are going to be bald. These types of superstitions exist, and fundamentally, the impact is to just keep the animal source foods away from the women and the girls who need them in order not to die from pregnancy and childbirth. Serving on the WHO dietary guidelines, we have no power. honestly speaking, against entrenched gendered food rights. We can say women and girls should probably be getting more of the red meat, but we can give a dietary guideline, walk away, and then nothing is going to change on the ground. And I realized this working with USAID, and believe me, as a feminist, it really was very, very frustrating. And by the time toward the end of the time that the last years of USAID, I mentioned earlier, I was leading the Ethiopia Reach project of USAID's Livestock Systems Innovation Lab. My friend Sarah McCune at University of Florida was leading the Rwanda Reach project. We realized that when we needed to improve the health of women and children, but we couldn't, it wasn't culturally appropriate to say, give them the meat, keep it away from the boys and the men. And so we had to focus on what was more acceptable, dairy and eggs. And that was where we were starting. And this has been a real source of frustration. Even though USAID is terminated now, I'm on a Gates, I thankfully have a Gates Foundation grant to continue this work in Ethiopia. But I want us to think a little bit more about some of these cultural nuances. I mentioned in that last slide, anytime there is a scarce resource, whenever it becomes available, the most powerful people in the household and in the village grab it. It's the men and the boys. So what if we don't make it a scarce resource anymore? That's almost unthinkable, but let's consider the following question. In order to be able to produce more crops, to make more meat and other animal source foods more available, could agricultural biotechnology help? This is something that, in fact, surprisingly, in many low and middle income countries around the world, there's greater increasing acceptance of agricultural biotechnologies because they're beginning to recognize the potential benefits from the dietary standpoint. I'm going to be focusing specifically in this talk on genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, because this is by far the most common type of ag biotech crop that is being planted around the world. There are other new food biotechnologies, including RNA interference crops like corn, which I've also worked on in the past, lab-grown meat, which is too expensive really anywhere to be feasible, and then also CRISPR-Cas9 or gene-edited crops. But we're just going to be focusing on GMOs for tonight. I'm happy to talk with you more about these others later if you're interested. What is a GMO? This is any organism, it could be a plant, an animal, a bacterium, etc., that contains genes that we humans inserted into their genomes, rather than that organism acquiring the genes through conventional breeding, such as pollination. So hybrid crops are not a kind of GMO because you could bring together corn that was native to Mexico and corn that was native to Nebraska. They would naturally pollinate, and then they would produce offspring that have the traits of both. However, you don't typically have corn mating with soil bacteria, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later, or for that matter, rice mating with daffodils and maize. And I'm also going to be talking a bit more about those specific examples later. So what you heard already is that these transgenes, so to speak, can come from any species, like soil bacteria, like daffodils, and they don't just have to come from the host organism. Why would you do this in the first place? It's because the inserted genes can confer traits that that organism, like the maize plant or the corn plant or the rice plant, doesn't normally have, such as resistance to viruses, to viral infections, or resistance to insect pests. They might have better tolerance for drought or freezing conditions or hail. They might have an enhanced nutritional content. So this is where GM crops are currently being grown or traded around the world. When I started working in this area in the year 2000, this was much, much less dense with colors. It was the US, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and then Australia came onto the scene, and then more and more countries have started not just planting GM crops, but allowing their trade around the world, as you can see from this map here. But you can still see that there are many pockets in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, as well as Russia and former Soviet republics that are not yet participating in ag biotech planting or trade. What do these particular genetically modified crops do? The largest categories are the following. You might have heard about the herbicide tolerant, particularly glyphosate tolerant crops, like soybean, corn, canola, and sugar beets. There are, however, some current concerns regarding the potential impacts of glyphosate exposure on human health as well as on animal health. There are what are called the Bt crops, like Bt corn, Bt cotton, Bt eggplant, and Bt rice, that are producing certain pesticides, certain crystal proteins that are harmless to humans and to other animals, but are toxic to lepidoptera and insect pests that might otherwise feed on these crops. And so basically, they're producing their own pesticide, so you don't need a pesticidal spray. There are virus-resistant crops such as papayas and squash. The Amphora starchy potato, which helps to, the starch, basically you don't eat these potatoes, you use them to build cardboard, which is quite interesting. And then also the innate potato, which is slow browning. And then if you deep fry it, no acrylamide is produced, which is a chemical that's considered a probable carcinogen. So some of the health benefits from the current or soon to come GMOs. Some of our work has in the area of Bt corn, which is producing its own crystal proteins, which are pesticidal to insects, has shown that there are lower mycotoxins like aflatoxin in the corn. And the reason is that when you protect against insect pest damage, what you find is that, so if you happen to grow a garden yourself, and you might have some crops in it, like tomatoes, you might find that sometimes the insects damage your tomatoes or your zucchini or whatever else you might be growing. And so there'll be a little hole in your fruit or your vegetable. And sometimes you see a ring of mold growing where that hole is. And the reason for that is that when insects damage your crops like that, the fungi sense the exposed starches, and then they immediately colonize the crop and begin to produce toxins. And so what we found was that Bt corn has significantly lower mycotoxin levels, and that has direct impacts to improve human as well as animal health. Golden rice produces beta carotene because it's rice that has genes that were first included from daffodils and now are being included from maize, such that the rice is able to produce beta carotene. And this can be very beneficial to parts of the world where rice is a staple in the diet and they don't have many other sources of either beta carotene, like the carrots, the sweet potatoes, etc., or direct vitamin A, like livers. The innate potato reduces acrylamide production if you fry your potatoes. So now you can have French fries without worrying about exposure to acrylamide, which could be carcinogenic. The SDA soybean, well, SDA stands for stearidonic acid. Now, this is a variety of soybean not yet produced globally that if you consume it, the SDA gets converted to omega-3 fatty acids, which have a variety of benefits for our brains, for our hearts, a lot of health benefits. So those are all the benefits. You might be interested in the side of risks of GMOs. Typically, the way that they are assessed, at least in the United States and as well as in Canada, are looking at both the ecological impacts as well as the human health impacts. For ecological, and I used to work at EPA, and so particularly in the biopesticides and pollution prevention division, so we did these risk assessments for acute and chronic ecological effects to all of these different wildlife species, as well as the human health effects, potentially acute and chronic. And specifically, I was working in the EPA, but we were working with USDA and FDA because in the United States, there was a coordinated framework to regulate biotechnology where it's not just one agency, but it's 3 agencies working in conjunction to look at the agricultural safety issues, to look at the environmental issues, and then to look at the food safety and the human health issues. What are some of the things that we looked at? Can this particular GMO that we're assessing cause allergic reactions? This is a really interesting process by which we look at a number of different factors that can show if you're introducing a novel protein, how do you know whether people could become allergic to it? What is the source of the gene? If it's something like the peanut, which many people are allergic to, or shellfish, that's not a good idea. So typically, nobody tries to make GMOs from these particular problematic foods that many people are allergic to. And then what is the similarity between the transgenic protein and proteins that are known to cause allergies? What we did was to look at amino acid sequences. And then if there were amino acid sequences that resembled those of known allergens, then we said, okay, stop. We shouldn't allow this particular GMO. And then also we put the protein in the food matrix into simulated gastric acid, and we see how long it takes for that gastric acid to dissolve the protein into the constituent amino acids. And if it takes longer than an hour, then that's really problematic. We say, okay, the human can react in an allergic way to this protein that just refuses to degrade. And then also serum tests. If you do a blood test, does that raise the immunoglobulin E levels or IgE? And that indicates an allergic reaction. Just to give you an example of how we look at this. We look at compositional analysis. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We also look at some other issues. Well, in ecological risk assessment, we look at risks to all of these different groups of animals. Whoops, okay, there we go. I know that this is now over an hour, so I think I can skip through some of these. I'm happy to go into these in more detail. The BT corn, which I've done a lot of work on, herbicide tolerant crops and their attendant risks, as well as the benefits of golden rice, which is now actually being cultivated in the Philippines, not being cultivated in other parts of the world where it could be beneficial. And I want to add some final general thoughts, and I'm happy to expound more on any part that you would like to hear more about. By the way, that's a photo of my family in 1977, where I'm the baby that's reaching for the food, and I've been kind of obsessed with food ever since I was a little girl. And by the way, we were one of the SNAP families. We were beneficiaries of the SNAP program back in the 1970s. So I can say my sister and I are basically 100% created from ultra-processed foods because what we ate constantly, Stouffer's pizza, Gino's pizza, Totino's pizza, Morton pot pies, Chips Ahoy, Vienna fingers. You might remember some of these, but basically that was what we ate. Oh, and those slices of American cheese. That was what the SNAP diet was back then. It stayed that way for many, many decades. So I do think nutritional equity is an important issue that is not being included, but at least the SNAP program has been making improvements since that time. My general thought is the following, and that it may indeed be the case that very few people read the full US or WHO dietary guidelines, let alone follow them. Or they might be interested in following them for maybe a week or so, and then they go back to whatever they were originally doing. However, these dietary guidelines are still important because they could affect policies, including what belongs in a school lunch program. It could affect the United Nations Codex Alimentarius Commission, which makes guidelines that not only specifically affect individuals choosing their diets, but affects what companies are allowed or not allowed to produce. I would say that so a major change that has occurred is that whole milk is back in school lunches. At least when I was going through school, we only had whole milk. So this was back in the 1970s and the 1980s. I don't know at what point they changed to low fat and non-fat and no whole milk, but now it's back to whole milk as being an option along with low fat and non-fat now. What I think is that in spite of whatever the US might say, whatever WHO might say, whatever the impacts on food industries, even multinational companies, the resource poor regions and the rural regions of the world are not likely to have much impact from these dietary guidelines. If we just look at the current US dietary guidelines, I would say they're appropriate for females, athletes, and the elderly, and not for some other groups. From an environmental standpoint, however, there's a real push toward a plant-forward diet, which has a very good environmental justification. But maybe there's also an interest in finding ways to produce animal source foods that have a lower carbon footprint because we can't forget the current plight of women and girls in many low-income countries that need that animal source food in order to survive and to thrive because they can't as easily access nutritional supplements as we can here in the United States, in Canada, and in other high-income countries. Which is why I posed the question at the end, could biotech be of aid in this particular area? Not just in enabling improved yields of the crops that feed the animals, but also in improving the nutritional content of already existing vegetables and fruits and grains. They're considered to be acceptable for women and girls to eat, and now maybe they might be able to contain nutrients that they actually need to survive and to thrive. And those are my final thoughts, and thank you very much for your attention, and I am happy to entertain any questions you might have. Thank you.
Well, thank you,
Thank
Felicia.
you.
We appreciate your sharing your knowledge with us. And I think you have a question in the chat from Terry. And let's let's just read that out. Yeah, so you've got several questions. Can you define nutritional equity? Um, okay, so some comments from Walt, but no questions. But Terry's question, can you define nutritional equity? I think you did start to talk about it, but could you just give a few words about that, please?
Sure, I'm happy to, and that's a great question. Nutritional equity is the notion that regardless of your socioeconomic status, you should be able to access and be able to readily eat the foods that provide nutrients for optimal health. That is not there's a lot of nutritional inequity in the United States now. I don't know what the case is in Canada for a variety of different reasons. So many different reasons, and I don't think the US government is necessarily responsible for all of them. One is that produce from a per unit weight perspective and even from a caloric perspective is much more expensive than some highly processed or ultra processed foods where produce has considerably higher nutritional content. Meat and animal source foods typically also have much higher nutritional content than all of these highly processed or ultra processed foods, which are relatively much cheaper, which, by the way, is why they were on the SNAP program, at least back in the 1970s and the 1980s. And these particular ultra processed and highly processed foods can be fortified with a variety of other nutrients, but it's typically thought that the nutrients, the way that they are contained within the produce or the animal source food, is packaged in such a way that the body is able to best absorb the nutrients. So, from the perspective of cost of food, there's a real difference in what rich people versus poor people in the United States are able to afford. And then you also need to consider geographic proximity and time. So if we happen to be living close to a grocery store, it's a lot less of a hassle for us to just run to the grocery store after we've finished a long day at work and pick up some good foods or ingredients to be able to eat. But if you live an hour away from the nearest grocery store, but you have a 7-Eleven or a gas station right there, which is selling candy, which is selling ice cream, which is selling beef jerky sticks and things like that, then um, from a convenience standpoint, it's much easier for you to go and pick up some of the foods there than to go venture out much further where you can buy the fresh fruits and vegetables like apples and bananas and leafy green vegetables, which are not usually sold in convenience stores. So there's also the issue of geographical equity. And then finally, there's also the issue, I guess I'm thinking specifically about households where there might be a single parent who's trying to raise children, and they oftentimes she is working two jobs or more in order to be able to sustain an income that can support her children and herself. Well, if you're working two jobs, you basically have really, really limited time to be able to cook. And so that's another reason you might be reaching for the ultra processed foods because you can easily pop them into the microwave. And once again, it's not a matter of having the luxury of time to chop up all the different vegetables or the meat to include in a diet that is nutritious. Those are some of the issues with surrounding nutrition equity. The ultimate goal is how can we provide sufficient nutrition for optimal health outcomes for Americans? And right now, we're not quite there. And there's so many things that would need to be in place for that to be there. And it wouldn't be only from a dietary side. There's also, again, some cultural issues.
Mhm.
Great.
Thank you, Felicia. One other question. Oh, two more. Uh, in the chart that showed the relative benefits of a vegan or vegetarian diet versus omnivore for different genders, what were the values, the ranges in parentheses? Can you give some examples of that? Or if you want to go
Okay,
back to that slide, you can share again.
absolutely. So I can share it
This
again
is
in one
from Bob
moment.
Simoni. And then,
Okay, that's a great question, and I hope this is the right
so
screen.
some of those were
Yes.
quite wide, um, especially some of the really dramatic ones.
Yes. Okay, here we go. So, usually, so this has to do with p-values and statistics. You have a mean value, which is the value that you see kind of outside of the parentheses. Like, I'll give you an example. If you take a look at I don't know if you can see where my cursor is. Let's take a look at men on a vegan diet. And we're looking at all-cause mortality risk over the course of 6 years. You can see that the average relative risk or hazard ratio is 0.72. And what that means is that men who followed a vegan diet were 28%, or 1 minus 0.72, 28% less likely to die of any cause over the course of 6 years than the men who followed the reference diet, which was an omnivorous diet. The 95% confidence intervals say not, because that effect size is kind of important on its own, but it needs to be statistically significant as well. And typically, from a statistical standpoint, we choose 95% confidence intervals, which means at the lower bound, I mean, this represents, I'm trying to think back, it's close to 2 standard deviations. So it represents a large swath of that subpopulation of men that was studied. And that says that for most men, there is a significant effect. And so you want those confidence intervals all to be less than 1. And if it's considered to be less than 1, then the entire effect is considered to be statistically significant. And in this particular case that I just highlighted, because the 95% confidence intervals are 56% to 92%, then there is statistical significance showing that, yes, men, at least the results from this study, men following a vegan diet were significantly less likely to die over the course of 6 years from any cause than, and this is also age adjusted, than men who follow an omnivorous diet. If you take a look at another one, and this is one of the ones that I kind of pointed out, women following a vegan diet dying from ischemic heart disease over the course of 6 years, where you can see the relative risk is 1.39, that's higher than 1. That's not a good look at all. But the 95% confidence intervals are actually not statistically significant because the lower bound is 87%, which means that a certain subset of the women were actually doing better on a vegan diet compared with the reference group, which was the omnivorous women. But then the upper bound was at 2.24, which I think is a really high relative risk, but it doesn't meet statistical significance.
Okay. Let's take Alan briefly and then get to Sunil's question in the chat. Alan, do you want to so let's be quick because we are running close to our end time.
I noticed that on some of these pyramids, particularly the new ones, lay upside down. But probably anytime they talk, it's basically focused on what you should eat, and things, that are a lot of sugary things and so forth aren't on there. And people who don't see them might say, well, if you're not that well educated, they may say, well, it's not really speaking to these things.
Right.
And I don't know if they're bad for me or not or whatever. And then there was a thing that said no added sugars. And that's something that we may understand, meaning no sugar that was not created by nature. But other people might say, well, this particular granola bar it's been the same amount of sugar for 3 decades. It doesn't have added sugar. It's got the same sugar. Or it's now a little smaller because of inflation. They've reduced the size of it, so it has less sugar. So that obviously is not a sugar-added product. No, so I'm just saying that some people may not understand that, and it just seems a little strange not to address that.
I think that's a really important point, and thank you for bringing it up, because I don't think most people are going to read the 11-page document, and that's not even a long report. Our WHO report for one of my committees was 450 pages long. I don't think the average American is even going to read those 11 pages. Instead, they are going to be looking at that inverted pyramid, and and you're right that one interpretation that they could easily say is, well, you don't address sugar at all on it. So the actual dietary guidelines do, but the picture doesn't. And it's an interesting thing because for the last 21 years, we haven't put the things that we want to keep out anywhere in the in the diet, in the graphic. The last one that did was that pyramid from 1992, which at the very top of the pyramid it said use fats, oils, and sugar sparingly. That was the last time that the graphic actually addressed it. Starting from 2005 with that new My Pyramid, that was gone. Um, and I do think that could be problematic. I think that that's a really good point. Maybe they would think, oh, okay, I can just eat red meat sprinkled with sugar or drizzled with honey or something like that, and it's not a good idea. Yeah, it's a really good point.
Sounds delicious. Um, Sunil asks, with reference to the mention of the microbiome, what do the new guidelines say about antibiotics added to animal feed, if they say anything at all, since they're
Yeah,
talking
that's
about
a
a
great
microbiome?
question because antibiotics can basically kill a lot of the gut microbiome. Um, that was not in the dietary guidelines. I think that probably they would have thought that's kind of outside of the purview of the dietary guidelines because medicine, even though it is within DHHS, medicine is not typically considered a constituent of the diet. For that reason, they're not going to make recommendations. Once again, it's about operating kind of in silos. So you can talk about a food that might be good for your gut microbiome. You can talk about foods that might be bad for the gut microbiome. But if it falls into the category of medicine, then it kind of falls outside the purview of something you can include.
Sure.
But yeah, but I completely agree. I mean, I think it is really useful for people to understand that if they are taking antibiotics, especially in the long term, they really do need to be concerned about not even just the short term, but even possibly a long-term impact on their gut microbiome.
Right. Thanks. And Joyce, you have a question. You have your hand up. Please go ahead. You're
Joyce,
muted,
I think
Joyce.
you're muted.
There we go. I do. My question is, has the Gates Foundation or someone like them experimented with distributing iron pills in Africa?
Great question. They have, and not only iron, but also the vitamin A capsules, which are kind of like the liquid. It looks like the
Mhm,
modern day rotavirus vaccines for babies,
mhm.
like basically just something that they squirt into children's mouths. Um, Gates Foundation has funded it. NIH through the Fogarty International Center has funded it. And there are a number of other international donors, and they usually do have very, very positive impacts, particularly on the vitamin A side, where it reduces the risk of blindness. It reduces child mortality. Very, very beneficial. On the iron side, I'm a little bit less familiar with that literature. Um, I can tell you about an example where people did the exact opposite of what they should have. Um, which is that, and these are some of my colleagues on the Food Systems for Nutrition Innovation Lab, which used to be part of the USAID. They developed a dietary, you know, they developed their own dietary guidelines, and you'll find that various groups do. Harvard does, Tufts does, all these different groups about what constitutes a healthy, like something like a healthy diet index or something like that. And then they went and administered it among pregnant Tanzanian women based on what they thought was beneficial, including the environment in the United States. And so anytime a pregnant Tanzanian woman said she ate red meat, they gave her score a -2.
Hmm.
And when he was presenting this work online, all of us started furiously writing into the comments like, I cannot believe you would be so clueless as to think that pregnant women in Tanzania should get a negative score for eating red meat. Please don't publish. I mean, don't let this be the message that goes out to them because they actually need it. And so many people protested that he finally was like, oh, yeah, 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 yeah. I can't use this um, metric because it's not relevant to that population.
Wow.
Yeah. So that has happened. I don't know the answer about the iron supplements. Now I'm interested in looking that up. Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you.
good idea. Good idea. Ken, you want to have the last question, and then I'll take a few minutes to wrap up.
Yeah, it's not a question, but I guess my timing's very good. I just wanted to make sure someone said out loud how fantastic this presentation was. I
Thank
was
you.
riveted, and the amount of work you put into it is very evident. I'm beyond thrilled with having the chance to sit and listen to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I
And
appreciate
Ken
it.
is hard to impress. So that's right. Well, thank you all for joining us. And